Welcome to The Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-episode series, we're going to be talking about podcasting. But our approach, appropriately enough, will be to examine how the medium fits into a scholarly context. By doing so, we'll be asking what makes something, whether it's a book, a journal article, or even a podcast, scholarly. What mechanisms, frameworks, standards, and techniques define scholarly content, and how malleable really is this definition? In what ways can the conventions of what we consider scholarly publishing be pushed into new territories? My guests for this series have been asking these very questions as they piloted a podcast series which then grew into a much more ambitious grant-funded project called the Amplified Podcast Network that's growing a network of podcasting as a form of scholarly communication, as well as building metadata standards and tools to help integrate podcasts into institutional archives and make them much more discoverable, all while establishing them as legitimate open educational resources. Joining me are Hannah McGregor, Assistant Professor of Publishing at Simon Fraser University. Hannah is also the creator and host of the Secret Feminist Agenda, the original pilot podcast that helped inform the development of the Amplified Podcast Network. Joining Hannah is Siobhan McMenemy, Senior Editor at Wilfrid Laurier University Press, which is partnered with Simon Fraser University, Wilfrid Laurier University Library, and the Documentary Media Society to create and support the network. Wilfrid Laurier University Press is the sponsor of this 4-episode series of The Authority File. In this first episode, Siobhan, Hannah, and I talk about how to make a podcast scholarly. All right, Siobhan and Hannah, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
All right. So maybe it makes sense to start by defining at least one term. I'm curious about how each of you defines scholarly or scholarship. Maybe another way of asking this question is what counts and then what should. And I'm asking because we'll eventually kind of tie this answer into the context of scholarly podcasting.
Siobhan, do you want to take a first stab at this extremely difficult question?
If I must begin, I shall. But Hannah's right. It's a question that might seem straightforward, and one can always turn to the dictionary. But that's not always the most helpful. I think since you've already alluded to podcasting specifically, what I might say is that it's been precisely my work with Hannah on the podcast Secret Feminist Agenda that I've actually given this a wider consideration, this question of what it means to be working with scholarship, producing scholarship, publishing scholarship, because at its base, the words imply simply school or education. But we know that from a publishing perspective, there are multiple forms of publishing, including educational publishing, including general or trade publishing, and including scholarly publishing. And so the definition of what a scholar is, what scholarship is, then becomes important to how I might determine what belongs in the line of work that I do. And so thinking about all of that, the work on podcasting has allowed me to determine as wide an engagement with the word as possible. But, principally, I think it's about a robust engagement with ideas, really. Ideas that were developed over time by someone through a lot of learning, reading, discussion, debate, and contemplation. And I think that that then, with a definition like that, affords all kinds of opportunities for the scholar, for the scholarly podcaster, for the scholarly publisher to engage in different kinds of knowledge production.
Okay, excellent. And then Hannah, how about you?
I love that definition a lot. There's a lot of really, what I should say is that Siobhan has significantly expanded the understandings of what constitutes the scholarly that I had coming into this project. I've tended to define the scholarly as work produced by scholars. But the second you lean into that kind of definition, you run into all kinds of institutional gatekeeping that say, well, scholarship isn't stuff that's created by amateurs or by community-based people who are still engaged in that kind of learning, lengthy thought, grappling with a complex problem. And I kind of think the exciting thing about podcasting is that it's really blowing open, for me at least as a scholar, my whole understanding of what constitutes the scholarly. That if you start to take apart the like traditional apparatuses of, well, it's published in particular venues, or it's written in a particular way, or it sounds a particular way, or it's made by a particular person, then if you sort of clear that stuff away, then you start having to actually say, like, oh, well, it's complex engagements with ideas that contribute to knowledge, that participate in a conversation. You know, you start having to get it at something else. And that question of what counts is, I think, much more interesting when we clear away all of the institutional gatekeeping definitions. Then we have to ask real questions about, like, well, how do we figure out what's contributing something new to knowledge?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was almost going to follow up my question with sort of a side remark, and it sort of depends on who you're asking almost. I mean, and I think, Hannah and Siobhan, what you've just described, I mean, it's kind of exciting in a way that you're allowing there to be sort of a flexible definition of what this can be, and that suddenly can contain different types of mediums, such as podcasting, or obviously the printed book is a traditional way of looking at it. But it's sounding like you're opening up sort of the purview of what scholarly could mean in terms of scholarly content.
Yeah, and if I could respond to that a little further, I would add that while, as I said at the outset, this podcast experiment with Hannah has really allowed me to become much more flexible through experimentation as much as anything else, but just to open my mind to alternatives to the conventions that I've been trained in over the years. It is a truth that, though perhaps not universally acknowledged, that scholarly publishers have been producing all kinds of publications for many, 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 many years. And, the most recent of which are doing the work of challenging some of these conventions are indeed the Born Digital projects, because they're in certain key ways quite radically different from the conventions of book publishing or journal publishing. But at the same time, we've been trying to reach audiences, whether they are fairly narrowly focused for the really very narrowly specialized scholarship that we publish, or more broadly appealing work that will attract an audience that is outside academe, that is occupying either professional relationships to the work of researchers or our community members with vested interest in the subject matter. Either way, or the many ways, the aim has been to try to find the form that best fits the work and the intentions of the creator, to reach whatever that audience is that they wish to reach.
Right. Excellent. Okay, I want to take a little step back into the past, and before we get into discussing the project that the two of you worked on, which is a scholarly podcast. If you could just talk a little bit about how the two of you met, what drew you together, and then ultimately working together on this project.
Yeah, absolutely. So Siobhan and my path had crossed a few different times when I was still a PhD student at the University of Guelph. So we knew of one another, knew each other to say hello at a conference. But the initiating conversation for this project came at Congress. Oh, do you remember what city that Congress was in?
No, I don't.
Me neither. Who knows? Congress. But it was the summer before I started my job at Simon Fraser University, and I was talking to Siobhan about the fact that I'd gotten this publishing studies job, and that I was really excited because it meant that I could carry on the work that I had already been experimenting in, using podcasts to try to build larger audiences for scholarly conversations. There's that word again. What does it mean? Who knows? Yeah. But I was already making this very silly podcast about Harry Potter that I had been thinking of as a kind of work of public scholarship. And Siobhan was like, well, I have also been thinking about how we might use podcasts at the press to engage different kinds of audiences or engage audiences differently in works of scholarship. So maybe we should talk more about this. And that was sort of the precipitating conversation for collaborating on a SSHRC Insight Development Grant to sort of first start this work.
Mm-hmm. So, and Siobhan, as Hannah mentioned, you were, prior to even meeting, you had already been mulling the concept of a scholarly podcast. I'm wondering if you could take us back to those days and tell us a little bit about your early thinking. What were some of your early ideas? What was the opportunity you were seeing? And kind of talk a little bit about why go into a scholarly podcast, and why did that timing make sense to you?
Well, one of the tasks of an editor at a university press is indeed to attend conferences and speak with the attendees and talk to them about their work and their interests and what's going on in their field, and to get a sense of trends or broad interests that are starting to form. And Hannah's right. I mean, the conversation arose very organically and somewhat coincidentally, but I think to sort of answer the question of which conference it was, as with Hannah's imminent shift in professional location, I think that was the first Congress that I attended as a Wilfrid Laurier University Press editor. And I had been thinking for a number of years before that about podcasts, but I certainly wouldn't claim to have had any grand vision of what I might be doing with a podcast, though I understood enough to know that the podcasts that had already surfaced here and there with university presses at that time tended to come out of the work of marketing departments. And even if an editor was involved at the press in the podcast production, they were usually meant to promote recent publications of that press and usually involved interviews with the author of the new book. And so it was an opportunity for an academic, usually, to talk about their new research and for the press to promote the book. And I knew that that was of limited interest to me, though I, of course, appreciate it as a promotional tool. I knew I wanted to work with the ideas that academics produce, because that's what I do. And I knew that I was not going to be the one to know in advance how to do that. I have a fairly decent understanding of my own limitations. And so it was really very fortuitous that Hannah and I got to talking, that we had already had correspondence with one another and meetings with one another, and that the fact of her already having experience working on Which Please was a huge advantage in terms of then being able to head into this project, which we decided to do at a later date. So I'm just pausing because I'm trying to think about how this then relates to your subsequent question, which I've now forgotten.
Well, that's okay. I think we could, just sticking with you for a second, Siobhan. I mean, maybe we can move into some of your thoughts on the ways the podcast concept took you beyond your traditional publishing role and or editorial role. I mean, how did the skills you developed through working in scholarly publishing translate to shaping a podcast?
Yeah, they're not terribly neatly.
Yeah.
I have to say,
Yeah.
and I certainly wouldn't speak about the skills that I am still developing as if they were finally honed. And I have to say that that's been the real joy of this work with Hannah, is that to be freed of conventions and to have been given the go ahead to experiment and not actually get too caught up in the failed attempts has been very liberating. But having said that, there are some ways in which editors approach text, if I can use text in the broadest academic sense, which would include audio. Then I think the idea that structure and voice, which in this case is literal as much as it is figurative, narrative flow, the ways in which one might engage recurring themes, for example, addressing component parts as well as the larger structure of the whole. These are all ways of approaching scholarship in a multitude of forms. And where I think I've been more comfortable are those instances where I can apply those particular editorial skills to the listening to the audio that I have to do with the podcasts. But I have to say, I think in some ways, the steepest learning curve for me has had to do with the listening, which is not a skill that I have failed to attend to over the years as a professional, but it really does require a different kind of brain activity. I'm going to just say, whether it's scientifically true or not. I feel equally exhausted working on audio as I do with a written text, but it's still, I can tell it's engaging a different kind of thinking or a different mode of editorial approach. And I'm not really sure I can articulate it more clearly than that, but to be able to listen to something over the period of 20 minutes to an hour, and you have to take notes differently than you do when you're marking up a manuscript for comment, and you have to think about the realities of the audio text, which includes, for example, at least with Secret Feminist Agenda, a spontaneity to the approach to the episodes that doesn't exist in most academic writing. It's usually fairly finely crafted and revised however many times before I even see it, to then offer further opportunities for revision. So there are some overlap, and I was grateful for that. I'm still really learning how to do this, in fact.
Yeah, aren't we all really with podcasts?
Well, that's a relief for me to know.
Yes, yeah, no, it's certainly an ongoing thing. Hannah, I wanted to jump back to you and just talk a little bit about what your research interests are. And we could Sir Siobhan mentioned your podcast, Witch Please, which is the podcast about Harry Potter. But why don't we start with sort of your professional focus?
Always a hilarious question for me, because the thing that I think we're supposed to do as academics, which is develop a sort of a niche or a specialty or a defined field that we're carving out, is something that I just consistently failed to do throughout my entire early academic career. I just kept doing things I found interesting that were largely unrelated to one another.
Okay.
Yeah, so I did a PhD in contemporary Canadian literature, and then I went and did a postdoc in middlebrow magazine history. And then I started a Harry Potter podcast. And it wasn't until I got the job at SFU, hilariously, like a year into the job at SFU, when I realized that actually publishing studies was a great description of what I did, which I sort of said to the chair of my department like it was a revelation. And he was like, yeah, we know we hired you for a job in this field, so we knew it was what you did. And I was like, I had no idea. This is great. So turns out my field of research is publishing studies. But what I am generally really interested in as a scholar is the question of how different contexts of publication frame the possibilities of the stories that can be told. And that has interested me in the sense of, the circulation of contemporary literary texts. I do a fair amount of research these days into the actual sort of industry of Canadian trade publishing, with a focus on systemic barriers to access, the sort of ingrained white supremacy and sexism in particular of the publishing industry as it currently exists. And then this work on podcasting has really led me into a parallel line of inquiry into scholarly communication, the sort of norms that have built up around what counts and what doesn't count, and sort of how and why we ought to be interrogating those. So it sort of has ended up being, and then I kind of do magazine history still too. So they've ended up braiding together. Yeah, I'm the publishing history professor in my department. So I continue to research and teach publishing history as well, which is really helpful for me in things like pushing back against contemporary norms around scholarly communication, because there's this lovely thing where when you start to historicize things, you find out that norms that are often treated as though they are universal and were always true are in fact like 30 years old.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think I could see how sort of your publishing history research and instruction can be helpful to the way you seem to be ricocheting around with your own interests, research interests, in terms of, the publishing industry in particular can be very malleable and quick to change and adopt new strategies and formats. And, so I would suppose that in certain corners of the publishing market could help inform your own interests.
Yeah. That's why I'm always trying to convince my students that publishing history matters if you want to work in the industry now. But
that's true.
we'll see how much I convince them of that.
Right.
But yeah, Which Please was really sort of my entry point into this podcasting piece of things. And it was entirely not my idea. It was entirely the idea of my collaborator, Marcel Cosman, who had some experience in campus radio production, which is a super important prehistory for a lot of podcasters. I think especially for a lot of how women and queer people get into podcasting often comes through starting off in campus radio. And she had some audio production experience, and we had decided we wanted to reread the Harry Potter books together for fun. We called it a friendship project, just a way to like hang out and do a thing. Yep. And then it was her idea to record it. And we were like, all right, sure, let's record this and see what happens. And I didn't learn how to produce, I didn't learn how to use a piece of editing software until 9 months into the project, when Marcel had a baby and I had to aggressively wrest some of the labor of the podcast away from her. And so I, sat down with a free copy of, what's the bad one? I always want to call it Audacity. Is it Audacity?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. The bad one, the real nightmare audio editing suite. I sat down with it one night and was like, cool, I can probably figure this out. I'm pretty smart. Which has been sort of roughly the extent of my my training as a podcaster has been a combination of the fact that I listened to a lot of podcasts and that I felt like I could probably figure it out.
That's always, yeah. That can go a number of different ways when you do the DIY approach, but
yeah, there was a lot of crying.
Yeah.
So there was less, having gone through the really hard DIY process of teaching myself how to edit around Witch Please. Secret Feminist Agenda, I definitely came into with more of a sense of like, okay, I've got a couple of years of doing this under my belt. I have a sense of what made that project wildly labor intensive and a sense of what I want to do with this project, which is make it more sustainable by making it less labor intensive, taking approaches that would reduce the amount of production that I had to do because I wanted to make it weekly. Initially, Secret Feminist Agenda was weekly. And I knew that if I wanted to make a weekly podcast, it had to be production light. So I just, that was sort of, I think, how Witch Please influenced Secret Feminist Agenda, was in the sense of, I knew that Witch Please took 4 hours to record, 10 hours to prepare for, and 12 hours to edit. And that I didn't want Secret Feminist Agenda to be like that.
Yeah, who would? I mean,
yeah.
So just real quick, what is the premise for Secret Feminist Agenda?
Secret Feminist Agenda, the premise, the tagline of the podcast is because feminists are inherently interesting. And the premise is that there is a great and profound delight in having one-on-one conversations with extremely interesting feminists about their feminism. And I'm particularly interested in the question of how people who understand themselves as feminists, or perhaps who have a complex relationship to understanding themselves as feminists, enact what they think their feminism looks like on a daily basis. So how does it come through in choices that you make in your life? How does it come through in the kind of career path that you have ended up forging for yourself? And that was where I started, just really wanting to have conversations with people I found interesting. The sort of side bonus was that I was brand new to a city where I didn't know anybody. And I was really trying to build a community for myself here. And so I thought, like, well, I'll find some people who look really cool, and then I'll ask them to be on my podcast.
All right. So before we break for the next episode, I just one quick follow-up to that, Hannah, is that were you intending, or at that time, had you intended Secret Feminist Agenda to have a particularly scholarly bent to it or characteristic?
I absolutely did not. Siobhan and I had already gotten the Insight Development Grant, and we had a plan to start creating together a scholarly podcast. And then meanwhile, I started Secret Feminist Agenda because I wanted to build a space for these conversations that I found exciting. And it wasn't until I emailed Siobhan and said, okay, I'm starting to come up with ideas for what I think my scholarly podcast should be, when Siobhan was like, you're already making a scholarly podcast. It's that podcast you just started. What if we use that? And I was like, are we sure it's scholarly? Which leads us right back to that first question.
Absolutely.
Exactly. You just heard from Hannah McGregor, Assistant Professor of Publishing at Simon Fraser University. Hannah is also the creator and host of the Secret Feminist Agenda podcast. You also heard from Siobhan McManamy, Senior Editor at Wilfrid Laurier University Press. This series is brought to you by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week when we continue our conversation and talk about the launch of the Secret Feminist Agenda podcast and how a customized peer review process helped its development as a vehicle for scholarly communication.
I think one of the things that was really important to Hannah initially, and increasingly important and sensible from my point of view, was that the peer review, first of all, should be an open one. And I guess I should back up just a bit to say that there had to be a peer review process because it's integral to the processes followed in publishing. And this peer review experiment with the podcast was a valuable opportunity for us to engage with the questions that have arisen over the course of time that have led scholars like Hannah to feel apprehensive about peer review.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.